Oh, go ahead, Jordan.
Oh, I was
Sorry.
just going to say it's 10:30, so we can get started. I just wanted to say hello to everyone and welcome you to part 2 of our Roundtable mini-series, IT Security Challenge, What's Important. Before we start, I would just like to remind everyone that they are on mute and their video is off, but if you'd like to ask a question, please use the chat feature to our panelists and we'll get your questions answered. This roundtable is being recorded and a recording will be sent out later as well as listed on our YouTube channel. To get started, I'll introduce our panelists. Today, we have Matt Briggs, our Director of New Business Development. We have James Melchor, our CTO, and Sean Trocek, our IT Security Lead. And so I will now hand it over to you guys. Go ahead.
All right. Thanks, Jordan. I appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for attending. We appreciate your time. As with our other roundtable sessions, 30 minutes, kind of rapid fire Q&A. Really like this format. We've gotten some good feedback. James and Sean are going to be in the line of fire. Please ping Jordan with questions at any time. She'll break in so that we're getting to your questions as quickly as we can. And then if not, we'll address them in email after the session's done. In regard to content, part 2 of a 3-part series in regard to IT security and protect what's important. I got to tell you, I really love talking about IT security. So this is going to be another fun session. Today we'll be focused on really developing or tuning a security program and then executing on that plan once it's documented. And so we are just going to dive right in. So Sean, you first, and then James, please follow. What are the critical steps in either building a security program from the ground up, I'll say, or if an organization has one that's potentially half-baked, assisting in tuning that program?
All right, thank you, Matt. As usual, I was trying to think of another analogy, and this time I came up with a bit of a spectrum. So there's a clunker type car, and it's got run flat tires on it, which you kind of look at that and think, well, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And then maybe you've got someone who's bought a limo to commute to work and they're driving it themselves. So there's kind of these two different ends of the spectrum. So looking at that using a real world analogy, I thought, well, what you really want to do, first of all, is get alignment with your business. Really try to understand, hey, where is this car going? How fast do we need to get there? Can we afford any downtime? If we do have some downtime, how long can we afford to be down? All those types of basic questions. And then what that does is that turns into kind of a business question into an IT question, which ultimately becomes, how many days can we afford to be down? And then not only that, how many breaches can we afford, right? So when you start to put things like that, I think the business will say, now that you put it that way, let's talk a little bit further. And of course, there's some other steps that will go in with that, which I'll talk about a little bit further probably. But that's instrumentation and inventory. And then after that, you'll probably get into planning a bit. And then once you've got a good plan, you'll swing back around and try to assess is what you're doing, is that the right thing? Does it make sense still? Which comes back to alignment. So that's kind of the overall steps from my point of view.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sean. James, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with Sean, and really, from my perspective, it's the critical steps are really understanding what a program is, not focusing on the tooling. You probably heard that in the other, right? So the big thing is not looking at it as how I can meet these needs with a specific tool. It's really just getting an understanding of what are those needs? Like, what are we trying to protect, right? From a security program perspective. What type of business are you in? That's a big one too. Understanding, what compliances are there, what compliance by proxy needs are in place as well. A lot of small businesses that work with other businesses don't realize those certain businesses have to comply with maybe like CMMC or some other type of compliance. So one, just understand that, and then from there, then start building out what the requirements are. I really think to set up a security program, you got to understand what the requirements are, and then understanding your maturity from a security perspective as well, right? That's another big item that needs to be taken into consideration. But from there, then you can start, once you understand those, you can start understanding what type of tooling and other things like that can come in place.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I know we kind of harp on the fixation with tools and instrumentation, and from my standpoint, there's been this shift from and hopefully a lot of other organizations are going to follow suit, but protection, right? So we look at the tools, the firewalls, the next gen AV, secure internet gateway, all of that stuff. I mean, that is protection from something bad happening, but there's a shift preventing a threat actor from inflicting the damage they set forth to inflict, right? So you go into more of this prevention mode, which is above and beyond these tools that are protecting the perimeter and the network. So that all starts with a really good security program. And I would just say zoom out and look at the big picture versus being stuck on the technology itself and making those decisions in a vacuum. To Sean's point, make sure they're aligned with the business and where it's going.
Yeah.
So Sean, what are the common mistakes made by organizations when approaching building out that holistic security program?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of different points on that one I want to make. One is, with everything that we just said about tooling and foundational elements, I think part of that is that there is a realization, and returning to my car analogy, that there are some things that are kind of obvious that you need. So you've got this clunker car, you've got a limousine, doesn't matter either way, you still need tires, right? So you're going to still need some basic components. And for me, in the IT world, that's your email protection nowadays. That's probably one of the big ones, and the backups as well. So those are probably the hot two. And then if you want to add a distant third, not a distant third, but another one, it might be this accounting and authentication. So those are some big ticket items to kind of really think about that you're going to need regardless. But then moving beyond that, what I'd say is let's start looking at where the big risks are at. So after you kind of get that alignment with the business, you're trying to understand, okay, where are we going? How far are we going? How much downtime can we afford, and so on. What you'll kind of do is inventory those business risks, and then also inventory your IT risks. So that, and a lot of that can be you're spending a lot of time maybe troubleshooting, and so you can't attend to some of these risks. So maybe that in and of itself is a risk. Or maybe you've got incidents and those are taking time away from strategic planning and stuff like that. So that's another risk to look at. So I think the big mistakes, don't get me wrong, there's some basic tooling you do want to get out of the way. But beyond that, is kind of getting into these traps and this time, you get sucked away, you have no idea where it went, and then the business starts to lose faith in you, and the whole thing just kind of goes kaput. So that's my opinion on the big mistakes.
Yeah, James?
Yeah, I think some of the common and big mistakes are really underestimating what it takes to build a security program, to be honest. It's not always a shoestring budget, right? You need to understand what you need and not saying, hey, go buy the most expensive tools and things, but it takes investment from business units to understand, what type of data risks, what type of data is, important to the organization or needs to be secured. So really it's not understanding the demand or the need from the organization of the time to build out a security program, right? It's not fixed by a tool. We talked about that in the first question, but I mean, really, it's really needs to be an investment by the business, and I think a lot of people underestimate it. And then they get into the middle of it and realize, wow, okay, I don't know what to do or how to dig myself out of this hole, or then they start looking for partners and other individuals. So I think just one, taking a step back, like you said, Matt, and trying to look at it from a big picture perspective. And then understanding this security program is really going to touch every department within my organization. So I really need to make it an important initiative for my organization.
Yeah, thanks, guys. And I'll just add one thing. I mean, from my perspective, what I see in the field is it takes a certain resource that you need to bring to the table to help develop, create the security program, and it's a niche skill set in that that individual needs to have business acumen and understand those business goals and objectives, but at the same time have a really good understanding from a security perspective, right? A top-notch security practitioner. And those types of folks don't grow on trees, to be honest. And so, if you have that type of resource internally, good for you. If you don't, I would certainly look at flexing into a third party to help steer you in the right direction, right? Because if it's somebody that doesn't have a combination of those two things, then the security program likely won't be very effective. So.
Great point.
We have a lot of conversations, guys, about buying, versus, building, when to pivot to potentially outsourcing, maybe not all the stuff, but, some of the things. So when is the right time to pivot to a managed security provider, Sean?
So returning to the car just a little bit, there's certain components that you're going to realize, hey, look, that's just not my specialty. And I think, especially in the area of IT, there are some things that are just specialized in nature. It's just the way they are. So there comes a point where in your organization, you have a requirement for understanding the organization, understanding the context, and so on. And so there may be this tendency to say, well, we need to keep that security awareness and knowledge inside. But then at a certain point, just as with the cars, right, you have things that are common. So you've got tires, every limo or a clunker, doesn't matter, needs a tire. And so in security, there are a number of things that are common across the board that those specialists do know how to handle very efficiently. And so once you start to figure out that it's probably going to cost you more to do that job yourself and to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak, in the security world, then at that point it may be a good decision to say, well, we'd like to do that. We'd like to keep a lot of this context in-house, and maybe you can still do some of that. But then there's a lot of this stuff that you can probably farm out at that point. And that's the way I would probably look at it. And,
yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, to Matt, to add to that from my perspective, I mean, really, your comment earlier about taking the step back, I think it's pretty straightforward. Do you have the internal resources to do it? Do you have the internal knowledge that's required, right? And then two, do you have the amount of resources you need to get it done? And if you don't have those, and fourth would be timeline, right? How fast do you want to move? I think that's another major factor. So if basically it's no to majority of those, then, really you need to look outside, right? And especially if it's expertise. That's to your point, that they don't grow on trees, right? Those type of individuals. So, it really, if you're saying no to majority of those, and especially the timeline one, if there's an immediate need, it's very hard for people to come up to speed to be able to build out the security program and move forward with that. So really, if it's no to majority of those, I would definitely say you need to look outside. And expertise and timeline are the two big ones from my perspective.
Yeah, and James, Sean, I mean, we've talked a lot about this recently, just security catalyst. And I would say it's getting harder and harder to keep pace with, specifically where organizations are going, businesses need to go, for example, right? Digital, transformation, compliance or compliance by proxy. There's a whole host of things, right? I mean, revenue growth goals, maybe it's expanding into other geographies or going, sort of mobile first, work from anywhere. And that's just, a handful of, the business requires, IT and IT security operations to keep pace. And so, what I've seen is if businesses are operating at breakneck speeds, then, that's probably a good time to call in outside help. Not for everything, but for certainly areas that might become, squeaky wheel and prevent the business from going and reaching their goals and objectives. And so next one, what do you guys see as low-hanging fruit for those attendees that are thinking about potentially outsourcing certain services, solutions? What's the top hit list for you guys, Sean and James?
I think of a couple of different areas, but I always kind of come back to the instrumentation, and I've talked about this previously. To me, that's an easy one because the skill set requirements, not neglecting the commonality factors, but the skill set requirements are constantly increasing. It's just a very niche type field, and then just the cost factors as well. It's actually getting a lot less expensive to do that externally than it used to be. So to me, if you combine those two, that one's very obvious and at the top of the list. The other ones, and this is more tooling and so forth. But you look at the different types of activities that you find yourself involved in your day to day and whatnot. I would look at those things that can free up your time to focus more so on strategy versus daily, making sure the lights stay on and that type of stuff. And really that translates back into the business where, you can help them deal with the opportunities or lost opportunities really. So if the business, if it wants to grow, you're able to kind of help support that rather than, figuring out why the proverbial flux capacitor isn't working today. So.
Yeah, spot on, Sean. I couldn't agree with you more. James, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Sean on that one for sure. I mean, really, when you start looking at, the things that we talked about with staffing requirements, to operate a security program, those type of things, a lot of those and the tooling, a lot of those things can be converted into services that companies can subscribe to. And the pace that it requires, these companies to kind of keep up to date with things. Those are the advantages that the services have. But to Sean's point, I agree wholeheartedly. Those things that tie into business, those individuals that can help identify what the coming risks are, how they integrate into the business. Those are the roles that are critical for for a client or for any company to withhold and to have inside their company, right? But the services and other things like that definitely are things that could be subscribed to.
Yeah, and I mean that's our charter. Whether it's IT security, managed services, IT outsourcing, we want to elevate those internal resources so they can be as strategic to the business as possible. So the tactical, keeping the lights on tasks. Definitely low-hanging fruit as far as outsourcing. Just other, quick comments. Incident response. Always have, someone that you can lean into, especially on a 24/7 basis. If, there is a breach or an incident, and have that plan carved out. Certainly routinely assessing, the environment for gaps independently. And then also, ongoing testing. We talked a little bit about red teaming and blue teaming last time, but more unstructured, unannounced, testing of the security posture, is something that is easy and relatively inexpensive and highly valuable to outsource. So those are a few other things. And then security awareness training. Go to folks that live and breathe IT security every day, that can think like a hacker, a threat actor, so that they're continuing to educate your end user base, your VIP, so they don't become a target of something like phishing. Go ahead.
Yeah, Matt. So I'm gonna play on Sean's analogies, really around
Yes.
around cars and things like that. Think of it from a manufacturer perspective, right? Look at Ford, look at those. They outsource certain components, right? They get so big that they in-house some and then they outsource some. But the smaller competitors, what do? They outsource pretty much everything because that pulls them away from their core competency, right? So if you look at it from that perspective, as you're moving up that model from a growth and size, there's some things that you just can't afford to have inside your walls, right? Or something you're doing, because it's going to pull away from what your growth strategy is, right? So you're going to have to utilize service providers or other providers to do that, right? But at some point in time, there are times it makes sense to bring that back in-house or change your model, right, into a hybrid model when you get big. But even those larger ones sometimes outsource certain components so that they could stay focused on their core competency of their business. So, I think that's a good kind of way to look at it, right? So.
And let me add just a little bit to that. I was thinking about that this morning. At least from what I've seen, and we talked to just a lot of customers, potential customers, and so forth. And even in this space, in the SOC as a service and SOC, SIEM as a service, and things like that, just accounting and instrumentation. What I see is there seems to be kind of a distance. You probably can't see my hands. It's matching. There it goes. A distance from the context. And what I mean is within your business, there's certain context and information that you're going to have just knowing how that organization works that you may not ever get a third party to fully understand. So there's that component. And so trying to understand how much context that third party can absorb. I think a lot of it may depend on how big they are and how long they've been around. But at some point, the complaints I keep hearing over and over and over is that the larger and larger entities, the bigger they get, the less responsive they become. Is really what it boils down to. And so that's a very important factor. If you're going to try to outsource this function, let's say you do get a SOC or something like that, and you push it out like that. But if you find out that it's unresponsive and they don't have context, and you're just putting money over there, then at that point, that's kind of the worst of both worlds, right? So that's driving the clunker limo needing to work. So you don't want that either. I mean, you're paying a lot for it, but it's also not the best of what you want to do for resources.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. And in the interest of time, Sean had mentioned SOC as a service. I think most of you that are attending, understand, SOC, Security Operations Center, the as a service piece, maybe a little bit more, nebulous, but I'll just, our particular offering, tools and instrumentation that we keep, talking about. So the detection and response functionality, the threat hunting, because you guys know as well as we do, you're going to get breached at some point, and that should be your mindset. So ensuring that you're able to identify threats that are, inside the trusted network, figuring out, how they're moving, what it is, how to extinguish that threat, and then remediate. There's tools that can be delivered as a service, but as important, processes like, we use the NIST cybersecurity framework and then certainly the people, the human capital component, interpreting the data, writing up reports, and then obviously taking action. So that's really SOC as a service from our perspective. And I guess, guys, flip the last question over to you guys. And I think I'm going to show a slide too to help maybe illustrate our take on it. But how do you build a continuous improvement plan or model within that plan for security? We talk a lot about IT security maturity model. So Sean, if you can answer that one first, I'd appreciate it. I'll try to share my screen while you do.
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, I talked a little bit about this last time, but to me, it kind of comes back to picking your framework, right? So you want to pick a controls framework that, depending on what type of business you're in, where you're headed, what regulatory drivers. I'm speaking in more abstract terms, but pick a control framework. And let's say, for example, you're dealing with, I don't know, credit card data, then that might drive you towards something like a PCI. But let's say that you don't have any real driving forces, you just want to be more secure. Then okay, well maybe you might go to something like a CIS top 20, or even the CMMC or NIST 800-171. Those are fairly well-rounded and can work with a lot of organizations. And I would even add on the recent CMMC, it's got levels, which can be helpful for a lot of organizations that are trying to start out. But once you kind of figure out what framework you think best aligns with you, and basically it's just a process of going through those risks and mapping them up with, okay, well, what controls might help deal with those risks, and then ultimately you're trying to figure out what the cost is after everything's left over. So there's gonna be a cost to remediate that risk, and maybe some risk you're just as a business comfortable accepting. So that needs to be part of the discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. And then James, I'm sharing my screen. Something we normally don't on the roundtable, but I think the illustration will help folks understand, the maturity model as it relates to IT security. So, what's your take?
Yeah. So from a continuous improvement plan, how to build it. I mean, I think people have to look at it from the standpoint of one, you're always trying to improve what you have. Bad actors, hackers, whatever type of threats that are out there, they don't stop. So you're always having to assess what you're doing. So whatever you're building, as a security program, you're always having to assess yourself. You're always having to look at what you're doing and what you're doing differently. So there always has to be a self-assessment component of it that's I won't say real time, but pretty darn close to real time of what you're doing, how you're doing it, assessing what's out there, right? But to that point, you always also have to assess yourself against your overall security maturity model as well, right? So you need to understand where you're at, where you're trying to go, and where you're trying to stay, what you're trying to stay ahead of, right? And Matt, I don't know if you were going to go into this slide, but I can go into that if you like.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So, when I was talking about where, understanding where you're at, if you're just doing the basic stuff, passwords and patch management and things like that, you got to understand where you're at within that maturity model to properly build out where you need to go. And then how are you getting feedback on how you doing or progressing through that? So if you start moving up that stack, that's great, right? You got these tools, you got these processes in place, but you got to also take a step back and look at where how much have you progressed? What do I need to fix? What are the different threats out there, right? Some of those things might knock you back 3 or 4 steps in that maturity model, but you need to be constantly looking at those type of things. And then as you get to the point where you're more forward thinking and with the SOC detection and response, and really start moving towards that containment and remediation perspective, you always have to look at, what are those new trends, those new threats that are coming about, to make sure that you can stay in that piece. So there's a almost like a feedback loop in a way of where you're at on your security model.
Yeah. Thanks for that, James. I think we're making Jordan nervous because we're at about time. So it's time to wrap up. Sean, James, as always, appreciate the insight. Very educational. Jordan, back over to you.
Thanks, Matt. I just wanted to thank everybody for joining part 2 of our roundtable today. A recording will be sent out and also listed on our YouTube channel. And don't miss out on part 3 of our roundtable mini series happening on March 11th. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.
Thanks, guys.
Thank y'all.